Hello and welcome to Freed Indeed Live. And I am joined today by Caleb Van Baale. Is that how you pronounce Caleb
Van
Van
Baale.
Baale?
Van Baale.
Was it Van Baale? Van Baale. I guess that's good. Van Baale is kind of
Mm.
not so good. So Caleb Van Baale, and this is his first time on our show today, and we're going to be discussing iconoclasm. And I'm going to mostly yield the floor to Caleb today because I think he's got a lot of good stuff to share with us. So before I do that, if you get something out of today's show, if you get something out of our show in general and you want to support us, feel free to go to the link in the description below. And for as little as $1 a month, you can make a huge difference supporting Freed Indeed Ministries. Without further ado, Caleb, tell us a little bit about iconoclasm and why, in general. I guess I want to know a couple things right off the bat. What is iconoclasm? Why do most Protestant groups tend to embrace iconoclasm? And why has the historic church, whether that be Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, even Anglicanism and Lutheranism, why do these expressions of Christianity reject iconoclasm as a legitimate expression of Christian doctrine?
Well, from my perspective, one thing I've noticed, at least in my lifetime and among most of my peers who are evangelical Protestant, is iconoclasm isn't really too much of a thing, at least not nowadays. Like,
That's
you know,
good.
like whenever I go to I go to people's houses, I see like they'll have like a picture of Jesus on the wall or like a animals gone Noah's Ark or something. So
Right.
I don't think even the majority of like Protestants in America, I don't think are like terribly concerned with like having like pictures of like depicting like Christ or things in the Bible or people from it. Like I don't think it's really too big of a thing to find like a passionate iconoclast. You really have to search for one. You have to actively like find someone or go on the internet
Mm-hmm.
typically because I don't think most people care too much. I think the place where most Protestants, I think, get a little nervous about it is when it comes to like when the icons are used like being prayed to. I think they see that as idolatry, and while I'm not making any claims, I think it's one they don't really understand it
Mm.
because a lot of them are pretty far removed generationally from Catholicism.
Right.
Like as far back as I know, my family tree has not been Catholic, so at least not for many generations. So I think it's more so like I don't think most Protestants are concerned about like you know iconography necessarily depicting things from the Bible. I just think most of them might draw the line at using them for prayer.
Okay. So it's like so at least in Protestantism it's more like a lack of understanding, and you think that if somebody was sort of informed on these things, most people would just say, "Oh, okay, that's cool."
I think if they had like an explanation for why the Catholics, Orthodox, and some Protestants do it that way, like I think a good number of them would understand, with the
Okay.
exception of a few really passionate Protestants or ones that are really strict in those
So
doctrines.
so that's a good corrective for what I said before. Now, historically speaking, Protestantism has largely been iconoclastic, or at least sort of reformed
Mhm.
expressions like Calvinism or Arminianism. So, what's kind of the history of that? What are kind of the reasons why they had those conclusions, and how can we respond to those conclusions?
I'm not well researched exactly as to what exactly sparked iconoclasm, but one thing I do know is that it certainly was not the 95 Theses, and it was not the intention of Martin Luther.
Right.
And the thing with that, I don't know if you've ever seen the black and white movie about Martin Luther before or not.
Which one?
It's from 1954, I think.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, like, cause I mean, he talks about his concerns about the Catholic Church, like indulgences, which I mean, virtually everyone I think can agree something needed to be done about that.
Right.
I think like I think it was just overcompensation for how just kind of how corrupt and how arrogant the church in the West got. So I think it was more so. I guess it's kind of like a maybe it was like a them making a statement. I don't know. Like I said, I'm not very well researched on why the iconoclasm started, but I do remember at the end of that film, Martin Luther just kind of you know calling them out for that, saying like what does somebody need to go? Would somebody need to come into this church and see the crucifix of Jesus right there? Because that could have just been what they needed to see.
Right. Right. So that's a useful point that Martin Luther himself was actually not an iconoclast.
Hmm.
So, but going back further in history beyond Protestantism, iconoclasm, I think a lot of people today are shocked to know that iconoclasm was actually one of the early heresies that got shot down by the church.
Hmm.
Um, and basically, the Seventh Ecumenical Council refuted iconoclasm, and I've actually been wanting to do a video for a while about iconoclasm and kind of how, in my personal belief, and you can kind of push back on this if you want to, but it seems to me from my own research that iconoclasm is sort of the last, we might say, the last maybe effort of Gnosticism. It's like Gnosticism has lost all these battles, and then they have their sort of fall of Berlin moment in iconoclasm because Gnosticism is sort of trying to say that, okay, we lost all these other debates about human nature and stuff, but you've got to at least grant us that God can't be sort of present in his creation except in Jesus. So you've got Jesus, but then you've got this separate thing that's everything else in creation, and God isn't allowed to be acting through any of this stuff, any of the substance of creation. And the church says, nope, we're shooting that down too.
Right.
So maybe speak to that. What are kind of, I guess, to be charitable here, what are some of the ways that iconoclasts throughout history have tried to make a positive case for their point? And then how can we respond to that as well?
Well, I think I'll get to that, but the
Okay.
first I'm going to acknowledge your point. What you're saying with you were saying like Gnostics don't believe that like God would interact with the natural world, which is a good point because they probably see icons as like, well, this was probably created by the lesser evil God, which they believe that because Gnostics believe that everything in the material world is evil. So,
Right.
and I think the first iconoclasm was like maybe the 8th century. I could be wrong about that. I'm sure someone will correct me on that in the comments. But yeah, by that point, Gnosticism had pretty much died out. Maybe small pockets of it still existed. So that could have been kind of their final push. Be like, well, if we can't persuade anyone, just break their stuff. But
Right.
yeah, that's kind of where I get out of that. As for like positive cases for iconoclasm, I guess probably the most convincing point I've ever heard for it is just like when people point out, some people might say like icons. I've heard people say before are distraction or similar Christianity's distraction, and then this way you can just kind of focus on what's important. That's probably the most convincing case I've heard for iconoclasm. It's just like, you know, like why do we need this at all? It's just extra steps. Is probably the closest thing I've heard to a good case for it.
Okay.
I'm,
And do they have any do iconoclasts tend to have any biblical arguments to kind of back that up to try to say it's a distraction because something from the Bible?
um, I've never really heard anything directly. They'll usually kind of use like the only texts I've ever heard used against iconoclasm are pretty generic, like, oh, look at the Ten Commandments, or, Solomon like allowing idols to the temple, or
Right.
usually that's what I hear. But I mean, my only issue with that line of thinking is, if we took it that far, then, if we can't have like any relics of any kind, like the Ten Commandments, then should we not have the stones then? I mean, they were kind of rough in a
Right.
way. I mean, so it's like you can't represent anything. I mean, I guess we could just have, I don't know, white, kind of like white walls or something. I don't know, but I don't know if that would help any, because we're made to be visual creatures.
Right.
And God understands that, because God created everything to be good, including the material world, our eyes, our senses, everything. So, like, there's a reason God carved it out in stone. Like, not like, I mean, God could have easily just yelled at everyone like, "Oh, you shouldn't be worshiping this golden calf." But I think it makes a point where it's just like, not only did I write this down, but you guys had to keep it.
Right. Right, exactly. And I think too, if we examine the second commandment, I think what you find very clearly is that the second commandment is forbidding idolatry. But throughout the Old Testament, God allows for there to be images made that are not idols, but images of angels, images of various things. I mean, when you look at a synagogue from Jesus's own day, you find all kinds of images in it. We've excavated synagogues from Jesus's day, and what we've discovered is that they're filled with what Christians would recognize as icons,
Mhm.
and including, much to the shock and chagrin of many Western Protestants and even some Catholics, um, the we've found the signs of the zodiac, the 12 signs of the zodiac, very prominently displayed in synagogues. So this was part of their worship, was actually involved in the zodiac, and um and so that's very interesting to me, which makes sense if you think about it in terms of how much the calendar is important in ancient Israel.
Mhm.
And by the way, you were right about the dates for iconoclasm. I just checked it, and you were right. 787 was when iconoclasm was officially um, struck down by the church in the Seventh Ecumenical Council. So that would have been just towards the end of the 8th century, exactly where you said. So spot on there.
Mhm.
So yeah, and I think in the Old Testament, the only thing you weren't allowed to depict was God Himself.
Mhm.
But in the New Testament, we do depict Jesus, and we believe Jesus is God. So, maybe you could explain a little bit about why it is that in in the New Testament, in some sense, depictions of God has become something that is allowed.
from my understanding of it, the reason that Council Nicaea decided to allow icons was to remind people that Jesus is human.
That's right.
And it's real easy to forget that. And I mean, I can see why they did allow that because, I mean, growing up in church, sometimes I would forget that. In fact, I think sometimes
Right.
we all do.
Right.
He's a
Right. I
human
think
with a
it's very
personality.
important because it conveys a belief in the incarnation itself.
Mm-hmm.
If God has become man, then we
Mm-hmm.
can depict that man, and that's not a sin.
It's not.
So, really, iconoclasm in that sense becomes a Christological heresy itself, because if you're saying that you can't depict Christ because he's God, then you're denying the fullness of the incarnation.
Right.
So that is, and by the way, I don't think that all Reformed people who are into iconoclasm, I don't think they would deny the incarnation, but I think that in practice they are denying the incarnation. And so they,
Mm-hmm.
as Caleb said in the beginning of this, they need to be informed so that they can, um, to play on them calling themselves reformed, they need to reform out of that practice.
Mm-hmm.
um so now, so those are all very interesting points. Did you have anything else you wanted to kind of interject into that?
Right. Um. Well, I was going to mention, like, with the humanity of Jesus,
Hmm.
since like we were just saying, like he was human. I think that's maybe one concern I kind of have with, like, Orthodoxy liturgical Christianity is, like, I do know, like, in some of the Alexandrian school of thought, like, there was a few that took it so far that they kind of saw Jesus as being only God, kind of like, well, like the hypostatic union from Africa today still kind of affirm that, like, either he's kind of in one nature of human divine, some go as far to say he's just divine.
Hmm.
So my one concern is kind of when it kind of goes that far.
Right. Well, I think Cyril of Alexandria did a really good job addressing that by showing that Christ is fully God and fully man
Mhm.
without the confusion of the substance. So
Right.
you have later on, you're right, there were some who tried to say that Jesus isn't, it's not that he isn't God or man anymore.
Mhm.
That's a misrepresentation of their position,
Right.
but it's more like that they would say that he's blended them together and is a new nature that is both God and man,
Mhm.
but is one nature. So he's one nature that is simultaneously God and man, whereas we would say in the more classical orthodoxy, we
Mhm.
would say that Christ is both God and man.
Mhm.
As Presbyterian minister Shailin says it, God is two, or Jesus is 200%. He's fully God and fully man.
Mhm.
Um,
Right.
I've always liked that 200%. But yeah, so I think that's a good point, that if somebody is saying that Jesus is sort of blended into some new nature,
Mhm.
or that he is either God or either man now somehow, then that's problematic, right? You're either
Mhm.
going into Docetism or Arianism at that point.
Right. Right. Well.
So that's a good point.
Mhm.
So I know that your passion is for spiritual warfare.
Mhm.
So when we talk about iconoclasm, and kind of what is the relation between having a robust view of icons and spiritual warfare? Is there a relation? What is the relation? How do I work that in?
Mhm. Well, spiritual warfare is an internal and external thing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's primarily how you live out your life, your walk with God, and like it says, Ephesians 6, putting on the full armor of God and doing that daily. So how icons relate to that? I mean, I would say icons in a way kind of a depiction of holiness and people who live holy
Mm-hmm.
lives. So I could see that as maybe an example and a helpful tool for that. As for how it would directly correlate with spiritual warfare or like spiritual living, that I am not so sure of, but
I
I'm
see.
so not.
So let's well, that's great. So that's something that um that maybe your research didn't key in on. So
Hmm.
we'll see if we can tease that out right now. So in Orthodoxy, we talk about icons as kind of windows into heaven, windows
Hmm.
into the saintly realm.
Yeah.
And so icons then relate to spiritual warfare
Hmm.
because, as you said, spiritual warfare is both internal and external, right?
Hmm.
Demons are trying to gain a foothold within us, but demons themselves are external to us. So there's this internal and external struggle. So
Hmm.
there's a couple of ways that icons then relate to spiritual warfare and are part of it. One is icons have a place within our daily devotional life, which is the most essential piece for spiritual warfare, is our daily life of living in Christ and devotional. And through icons, we're able to gain more of a connection to the spiritual world in the same way that, if I have a photograph of my wife sitting on my desk at work, it helps me to keep, not that I sort of lose connection with her or lose touch with her, and also not that I'm able to sort of communicate with this picture as if it's her, but it's more like it keeps my own spiritual connection with her more fully engaged to have this picture of her right before me. And
Hmm.
the same thing is true of Christ and the saints. I have this icon of my patron saint, Tsar Nicholas, right before me while I'm praying. Then it helps keep that connection there, which helps also to repel demonic influences coming into me. So that's an internal way.
Hmm.
Externally, icons are beneficial to spiritual warfare because, in the same sense that if I, put up a bunch of pictures of, I don't know, my favorite rock band, I don't know, ACDC. If I'm putting up ACDC pictures everywhere, but my best buddy is a Nirvana fan and hates ACDC, and he shows up at my house, he might not feel so welcome because he's like, whoa, man. Everything. I mean, that's a terrible example because everybody loves ACDC and Nirvana. Like, nobody doesn't love either of those. But the point is that if you do this, that if you're putting up all these holy things, these objects that are blessings and that call us to love and faith in God, well, then it's obviously going to repel those beings that are opposed to God. They're at war with God and his saints. And so you're making your home, not only are you beautifying it in a way, but you're also making it a hostile environment. So maybe a better analogy than the stupid one that I gave earlier. A better analogy is when I take, the little airborne tablets and put them in water and drink the water, I'm making my body a hostile environment for disease. I'm creating within my own body a sort of ecosystem that fights disease. I'm strengthening my white blood cells and all these things, or at least that's what the little airborne thing advertises. I'm not sure how well it works, but if it worked as well as the advertisement says, then my body is now like armored against disease. And when diseases enter my body, they find in it a hostile environment that they can't live in. And that's what we're doing to the demons when we have icons. We're creating a hostile environment so that when demons show up, they are instantly repulsed by that presence. So I know you know a lot about spiritual warfare and things, so kind of feel free to push back and say like where what I'm saying makes sense, what I'm saying maybe what I'm saying doesn't make as much sense and you want to clarify some points. What's going through your head as I'm saying all of that about spiritual warfare and icons?
I think more so I'm gonna add on to what you said
Okay.
more than a rebuttal, but one thing I do notice is that you said icons are used as a place, kind of used to make it that to say make a statement that no demonic presence is welcome here. Kind of the same
Mhm.
way like more occultic relics or like with like Wicca or the New Age kind of invites them in.
Yeah, that's a good
And
point.
not only that, like I think that's one problem with iconoclasm is just like a lot of overcompensation. Like you say relics, the first thing they think of is New Age or the occult. It,
Right.
and it's it's definitely an overcompensation because it's like it's almost like saying some relics are demonic, some aren't, but you know what, I'm just not going to use any. That's almost like saying like some people use counterfeit $20 bills, so you know what, I'm not going to use any.
Right.
Like it's going a little overboard because you're saying like I don't want to fall into new age movements. Like the whole point of like the icons is to focus on like Christ and Christians throughout history that lived and even lost their own lives for the cause of his church. So,
Right.
and not only that, with, well, I do remember at my church we did like this we did kind of like this prayer thing, like for those like on their prayer team. And in the videos we were watching, the guy mentioned, I don't remember his name, but he mentioned that sometimes like he for the longest time didn't believe like in having like dreams or visions from God, and
Mm.
he didn't want to like he avoided that the best. He avoided like anything related to that because he was afraid he'd fall into the New Age movement. And then later on, he regretted that because he realized it's like I was just shutting myself off to God by trying to overcompensate
Right.
and not you know so
Right. That makes
so
sense.
yeah. And that's the thing about spiritual warfare. Like it says like I mentioned Ephesians 6 earlier, it says it's the armor of God, but it also mentions the sword of the spirits. Like like we're not supposed to hide in the shell. Sometimes you had to go on the offense too.
Right. That's a good point. That's a very good point. We have to be able to move in that sort of I mean it's kind of like in warfare, right? In physical warfare,
Hmm.
you can't just sit in your bunker and kind of take pot shots at the enemy. Eventually you have to move forward, otherwise you'll lose the battle when their reinforcements show up. That's a really great point. I'm glad that you said that. Now, you mentioned relics a lot, and I realize that this might be taking our discussion in a little bit of an odd direction, but I actually want to talk about relics
Hmm.
a little bit because I think this keys in on something that may be really helpful for people to understand. I think that a lot of iconoclasm and people's discomfort with these things is very cultural.
Hmm.
So, for example, States where I live, people tend to be uncomfortable with what they perceive as superstitious.
Mhm.
Um, which is fine. Like that, we all grant that there are some practices out there that are literally just superstition, right? Like
Mhm.
maybe, I don't know, if I sneeze and then throw salt behind my shoulder, maybe that's a weird practice or whatever. So, um, anyway, point being, I think a lot of people don't realize, though, that when we talk about, so I'll say it this way: when I was a Protestant, I was uncomfortable with icons and relics, and it's very interesting that the way I came to realize that this was for me a very cultural expression and not really biblical was I was at university and I was studying relics themselves because I was going to do a paper on relics. And I thought that I was going to find out that relics were this absurd, superstitious practice of Roman Catholics and all this. But what I actually discovered was that the Bible talks about relics. St. Paul gives sick people handkerchiefs and it heals them. That was relics. St. Paul is touching these holy objects, and or they weren't holy until he touched them. But see, again, I think our aversion to relics comes from a very Gnostic sense that we think that the world around us, like we think that there's the spirit world and the physical world, and the two shall never meet.
Mhm.
But in God's economy, that's not true, right? In God's economy, the two are very connected and interconnected. And the bodies of people, our body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, right?
Oh yeah.
So if our body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, then the Holy Spirit then is working through that body. And this is what the Orthodox Church has always taught. So I know it doesn't surprise you to hear me saying that. But what did surprise me as a Protestant was that there was a whole bunch of Bible passages that I really couldn't fit into an iconoclastic anti-relic paradigm. So for example, even in the Old Testament, you have the bones of the prophet Elisha, and there's the soldier who's running through the field or whatever, and he falls on the bones and he's dead, but when he touches the bones he comes back to life. Well, again, this is an example. You don't have to call it relics if you don't like that word, but this is an example of what we are talking about when we talk about relics in the Orthodox Church, that God has so thoroughly permeated this physical object that the object itself actually has power. And so our goal as Christians is to become relics. We want to be so thoroughly united to God that our very bodies have his spirit working through them. So what do you think about that? What do you think about the idea that a lot of sort of the aversion to this stuff is cultural, but if we really submit to the authority of Scripture, then we can kind of set our cultural preferences aside and learn what God's cultural preferences are. What do you think about that? Am I overstating my case, understating it? What's up with that?
Well, I'd say if you are overstating your case, I am agreeing. So overwhelmingly, and like what you said with like it being cultural, like here in America, we kind of have this culture of being like, well, we have this culture of like individualism, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Like everything is very individual. So like I know like Catholic and Orthodox practices are very collective and more
Mm-hmm.
collectivist in the way they do things. So they're kind of suspicious of that. And here in like here in the States, we seem to have this idea that's like we don't really like authority much typically. Most of us don't anyway. So it's like, they'll hear things like, monarchical bishops, they don't like that. A lot of Americans also have a culture of like, we're the home of McDonald's and Burger King. You tell people, be like, oh, you can't eat meat half the year. You're like, I can't what?
That's a very good point.
So there is that. And it's not even, I don't even think it's just that. I think it's the fact that our country was found on Protestant and iconoclastic values.
That is true.
Like, a lot of people like don't don't see that connection, but the little bit I have read of John Knox, like he had a lot of very revolutionary. Well, he had some
Hmm.
revolutionary views. Like, it's like it. It just seems that they had this idea of like, we need to reform. We need to like, resist the papacy. If so, we'll take any measures possible. Kind of like what you were saying the Gnostics did.
Right.
And not to say like, I personally don't like it when people are like, Calvinists or Gnostics or whatnot, but
Right.
there
It's
are comparisons. There are similarities.
right. Right. I don't think I think it's an overstatement to say that Calvinists are Gnostics. I think that there are some things that have Gnostic undertones in certain beliefs, and that, if you want to believe in something like predestination or whatever, we can discuss that and disagree about that separately, but I think you could potentially hold to Calvinistic ideas without the Gnostic trappings, with like just with their iconoclasm and things.
Right.
So I do think that's a valid point that you bring up.
For sure.
Um so I think we're kind of winding down here. Do you have any closing thoughts you want to share?
Well, I think my closing thoughts is like, I mean, I've watched some of your videos on your channel. I'm guessing I'm probably the first like evangelical like you've talked to. And I think that's kind of the thing. Like, there's not a lot of dialogue between us and the Orthodox or us and the Catholics, especially the former. I feel like if there was more dialogue between two, there'd be more understanding between the two. And I'm not necessarily saying we're more right than you or anything like that. I just think like that's the only way like anything's ever been achieved. The Council of Nicaea was a dialogue, and the
Hmm.
Iconoclasm was certainly not. And look where we are now.
Right.
So I just see it as like, people should do their research and they should try to research the history. One thing I learned from this is I probably should research the history of iconoclasm a little more. But if people like want to be iconoclastic, it's like, you can, but do your research, do your background. If you make a good case for it, then you know maybe you can convince me. But I just don't really hear any like good cases for it. At least not any that are consistent with a Christian worldview, or
Hmm.
even like, or just any of that really. Not even with like a Protestant worldview. It doesn't really even fit with that because it's like, we're also, that's another thing I've always thought was so weird. Is like in America, we're so concerned about property rights, but with iconoclasm, we make an exception. So
Right.
I don't see how that really fits or how that really works. If somebody can find a way to explain it to me in a way that makes sense, maybe they could convince me, but I haven't heard anything. And as for how that relates to spiritual warfare, like, like I said, with, individualism, you know, it's like we're in a war, and wars aren't fight with individuals, they're fight with armies.
Right.
They're they're led by, the sons of the king, which is Jesus, of course.
That's right.
It's like spiritual warfare is not just like, you know, like you were saying with with icons and all that, having that at home praying. Like, yeah, that's a part of it too, but we have to all be doing it for it to be effective. And
That's right.
that's kind of where I think iconoclasm's gone wrong. It's just like, oh, it's just like the one way tunnel between me and God. It's like, yeah, I mean, it is kind of like, yeah, you can just pray to God anywhere. That's true. But the problem is like, if you just make it between you and God, it's like, and it can be very easy, like we said, to forget that Jesus is human, or that like he lived the life like we did. Well, I mean, he lived a sinless life, but a lot of people can get easily distracted. I mean, it's
Right.
human nature. So it's like, if it's just between you and God, if you're not careful, it can just be between you and you.
Right.
And then
That's very true.
you're fighting alone, and then what do you achieve? Nothing. So it's like, even if some people think we'd be better off without icons, I even if they sincerely believe that, I just don't see how we're better off smashing them. I just haven't heard a convincing argument for it.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So there you go. I love it. I love what Caleb just said about that ability to dialogue. I think that's really important. Um, I'm definitely not an ecumenist, but I do believe that there's a kind of positive ecumenism that happens when we're able to dialogue and hash things out in a respectful way. And I'm glad that Caleb and I were able to do that today.
Mhm.
So thank you for watching, everybody who did watch, and everybody who will end up watching once again. I want to stress, if you really love what we're doing at Freed Indeed Ministries, if you want to see more dialogues of this sort, please let us know in the comments below that this is what you're after and you want to see more of this kind of ecumenical discussion. Let us know if you want to see more discussions about spiritual warfare. Even if you want to see follow up on this topic of iconoclasm, feel free to let us know in the comments. And of course, once again, for as little as $1 a month, you can really help Freed Indeed Ministries out at Patreon. So thank you again. God bless. And be sure to share this with your friends so they too can be freed indeed.